When 59-year-old Eleanor Harrington used her last $15,000 to purchase an abandoned fire station in the small town of Millfield, Connecticut, her 3 adult children thought she'd finally lost her grip on reality. But when a basement flood led to the discovery of World War II-era war bonds worth over $250 million, she proved that sometimes the darkest moments can lead to the most extraordinary second chances. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning fog hung heavy over the Millfield town square as Eleanor Harrington parked her weathered Toyota Corolla across from the courthouse. She gripped the leather portfolio containing her life savings and mortgage pre-approval letter, her knuckles white with determination. For most people, the municipal auction that morning represented an opportunity for investment. For Eleanor, it was her final chance at rebuilding a life that had crumbled beneath her feet. 8 months earlier, Eleanor's world had collapsed when her husband of 35 years, Richard, died suddenly from an aneurysm at age 61. They had been high school sweethearts who built a comfortable middle-class life together, raising 3 children and planning for a retirement that would never come. What Eleanor didn't know until after Richard's funeral was that their financial situation was far more precarious than she'd realized. I remember sitting at our kitchen table with our family attorney, trying to make sense of the paperwork. Eleanor would later recall. Richard had cashed out his life insurance policy 2 years earlier to invest in his brother's restaurant venture. The business had failed spectacularly, taking our retirement savings with it. Our house had a second mortgage I knew nothing about, and the medical bills kept arriving. I had exactly $23,450 in my personal savings account and a house worth significantly less than what we owed on it. Eleanor's financial catastrophe wasn't unusual. Studies show that nearly 45% of widows experience significant financial hardship within the first year after losing a spouse. The combination of reduced income, unexpected debts, and the economic reality of single living creates a perfect storm of financial vulnerability. What made Eleanor's story different was what she decided to do next. Rather than filing for bankruptcy or moving in with one of her children as they suggested, Eleanor made a decision that seemed completely irrational to everyone who knew her. She decided to liquidate what little she had left and purchase a dilapidated commercial property, specifically Millfield's abandoned fire station, No. 3, which had been vacant for nearly a decade after the town consolidated its emergency services. "Mom, this is absolutely insane," her oldest daughter Jessica had said when Eleanor shared her plan. "You have no experience in real estate development or commercial property management. You're about to be homeless, and instead of finding a sensible apartment, you want to buy a run-down fire station? For what purpose?" Eleanor's son Michael, a financial advisor in Boston, had been even more direct. "Mom, I work with investments for a living. This is literally the worst financial decision you could make right now. You need stability and security, not a money pit that will drain your last resources." Her youngest daughter, Samantha, had simply cried and begged her mother to reconsider. "Dad would want you to be safe, not gambling everything on some crazy scheme," she had said through tears. But Eleanor saw something in the old fire station that her children couldn't. Built in 1912, the 2-story brick building had character and history that newer structures lacked. More importantly, it sat on the edge of Millfield's slowly revitalizing downtown district, where property values had begun to rise after decades of decline. The building had been repeatedly passed over at previous auctions due to its poor condition and the estimated renovation costs. But Eleanor had spent weeks researching adaptive reuse projects and believed the property had potential. "I'm not just buying a building," she had told her skeptical children. "I'm buying a chance to create something new, something that belongs entirely to me. For 35 years, I was Richard's wife. Now I need to figure out who Eleanor Harrington is on her own." The bidding began at 10 a.m. sharp. Eleanor watched as commercial properties were snapped up by developers and investment groups whose representatives arrived with thick folders of research and financial projections. These were professionals who bought and sold properties for a living, not desperate widows with dwindling bank accounts. Eleanor felt increasingly out of place among the power suits and confident bids. When Lot 17 was announced, former fire station, No. 3, 1435 Maple Street, approximately 4,200 square feet on 0.8 acres, the room grew noticeably quieter. A few potential bidders flipped through their paperwork, but most didn't even look up. Opening bid for Lot 17 is $25,000, the auctioneer announced. Do I hear $25,000? The room remained silent. All right, let's start lower. Do I hear $20,000 for the former fire station? Still no response. $15,000? Can I get $15,000 for this property? Eleanor's hand shot up before she could second-guess herself. We have $15,000 from bidder number 43, the auctioneer noted. Do I hear $16,000? The seconds ticked by in agonizing silence. Eleanor held her breath, simultaneously hoping someone would outbid her and praying they wouldn't. Going once. Going twice. Sold to bidder number 43 for $15,000. Just like that, Eleanor Harrington owned a fire station. The total cost, including fees and transfer taxes, came to $17,235. She had $6,215 left to her name, and a building that most professional developers had deemed worthless. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The reaction from Eleanor's family was swift and predictable. Jessica drove down from her home in Hartford that evening, walking through the dilapidated building with mounting horror. "Mom, this place is a disaster," she said, gesturing at the water-damaged ceiling, cracked concrete floors, and electrical system that clearly hadn't been updated in decades. "The renovation costs will be astronomical. You've thrown away your last resources on a building that should probably be condemned." Michael called from Boston, his voice tight with frustration. "Mom, please tell me there's still time to back out of this. Whatever deposit you put down, I'll cover it. This is financial suicide." Samantha simply texted, "I'm worried about you. Please reconsider this decision before it's too late." But as Eleanor stood alone in the cavernous garage bay where fire trucks had once parked, watching dust motes dance in the shafts of afternoon sunlight streaming through the tall windows, she felt something she hadn't experienced since Richard's death: possibility. For the first time in months, she was making decisions and taking action rather than simply reacting to one crisis after another. The property came with living quarters upstairs where firefighters had once slept during their shifts, a small kitchen, bathroom, and open dormitory space. It wasn't comfortable or pretty, but it was shelter. Eleanor moved in the following week, bringing only essential furniture and belongings from her former home, which was now in foreclosure proceedings. Her first night in the fire station was both terrifying and exhilarating. The building creaked and groaned, the plumbing clanked alarmingly, and the dormitory room felt cavernous and empty without proper dividing walls. But it was hers, paid for outright, with no mortgage or landlord. For the first time in her adult life, Eleanor was completely responsible for her own shelter, her own future. I sat on my bed that first night, listening to the rain hitting the roof, and I thought, what have I done? Eleanor later recalled. But there was also this strange sense of freedom. I had nothing left to lose, which meant I could try anything without fear of failure. Eleanor's plan, developed during weeks of late-night research, was to convert the ground floor into commercial rental spaces while creating a proper apartment for herself upstairs. She had calculated that with 3 retail units downstairs, She could generate enough rental income to support herself modestly while building equity in a property that might eventually have significant value. The challenge, of course, was finding the money to perform the necessary renovations. With only $6,215 remaining, Eleanor couldn't afford professional contractors or major structural work. She would have to tackle the project in stages, doing as much as possible herself and focusing on making one small section viable for rental as quickly as possible. Eleanor had never been particularly handy. During her marriage, Richard had handled home repairs and maintenance, leaving her with limited practical skills for the enormous task ahead. But necessity proved to be a powerful teacher. Eleanor began spending hours at the local library, checking out books on basic carpentry, plumbing, and electrical work. She watched countless YouTube tutorials on her aging laptop, taking careful notes and creating detailed plans for each phase of renovation. Her first project was clearing decades of accumulated junk from the building. The fire department had left behind broken equipment, rotting furniture, and mountains of paperwork that needed to be sorted through and disposed of properly. This task alone took 3 weeks of grueling physical labor. "I lost 12 pounds in the first month," Eleanor said. "I'd never worked so hard physically in my life. My hands were covered in blisters, my back ached constantly, and I collapsed into bed each night completely exhausted. But there was something deeply satisfying about seeing tangible progress each day." As news of Eleanor's project spread through Millfield's close-knit community, unexpected support began to emerge. Frank Delaney, the retired building inspector who lived 2 blocks away, stopped by one morning with coffee and donuts. After a quick tour, he offered to review her renovation plans and provide guidance on which issues needed professional attention versus what she could reasonably handle herself. "The building's bones are good," Frank told her, tapping the solid brick exterior. "These old municipal buildings were built to last. Your biggest challenges will be the electrical system, which is dangerously outdated, and the plumbing, which has probably suffered from freezing and thawing over the years the building sat vacant." Maria Gutierrez, who owned the successful bakery across the square, began bringing day-old bread and pastries each evening. "My husband worked at this station for 20 years, she explained. "He'd be happy to know someone's bringing it back to life instead of tearing it down." Even Eleanor's children began to soften their opposition as they saw her determination. Michael sent her a check for $5,000 with a note that read, "I still think this is crazy, but if you're going to do it anyway, please hire a licensed electrician. Love you, Mom." Samantha, who taught art at a nearby middle school, started spending weekends helping. Eleanor stripped peeling paint and cleaned decades of grime from the building's beautiful original windows. Jessica, though still skeptical, used her connections as a real estate attorney to find discounted building materials from construction sites with excess inventory. 2 months into the renovation, Eleanor had made surprising progress. The ground floor had been cleared and cleaned, with the largest bay divided into 2 potential retail spaces. She had installed temporary walls, replaced broken windows, and painted the previously grimy interior walls a clean, bright white. The upstairs living quarters were still rudimentary, but she had created a functional bedroom and bathroom, with plans to expand into a proper apartment once rental income began flowing. Then came the rainstorm that would change everything. October in Connecticut can bring relentless rain, and this particular storm dumped nearly 7 inches in 48 hours. Eleanor awoke at 3:17 a.m. to the sound of rushing water. Racing downstairs with a flashlight, she discovered that the ancient drainage system had failed catastrophically. Water was pouring into the basement through multiple entry points, already reaching nearly 2 feet deep at the bottom of the stairs. I stood there in my pajamas, watching water destroy what little progress I had made, and I nearly gave up, Eleanor recalled. This seemed like the universe confirming what everyone had told me, that I had made a terrible mistake, that I was in over my head, that I should have listened to reason. Eleanor called the emergency number Frank had given her, and he arrived within 20 minutes, bringing an industrial pump borrowed from a construction friend. Together, they waded into the flooded basement to position the pump, working by flashlight in the cold, murky water. "We need to find the main drain access point," Frank shouted over the noise of rushing water. "There should be a large clean-out pipe somewhere along the east wall. That's our best chance of getting ahead of this flood." Eleanor sloshed through the water, sweeping her flashlight beam across the walls, searching for anything that looked like a drainage access. The basement had been the one area of the building she had largely ignored during her renovation efforts, using it only for storage of materials she wasn't yet ready to use or discard. As the water level continued to rise despite the pump's efforts, Eleanor's flashlight beam caught something unusual. What she had previously assumed was just another section of concrete wall had shifted in the flooding, revealing what appeared to be a small metal access panel that had been concealed behind decades of accumulated grime and hastily applied paint. "Frank, I found something over here," Eleanor called, wading toward the mysterious panel. "It looks like some kind of access door, but it's not for plumbing." Frank joined her, examining the metal panel with experienced eyes. "That's not standard for this building's era. Someone added this later and went to some trouble to hide it." Using a screwdriver from his toolkit, Frank pried at the edges of the panel, which reluctantly gave way after decades of being sealed shut. Behind it was a small cavity in the wall, and inside that cavity was a metal box, approximately the size of a large briefcase, secured with a heavy padlock that had long since corroded in the damp conditions. "Let's get this upstairs where it's dry," Frank suggested, helping Eleanor lift the surprisingly heavy box. "We still need to deal with this flooding, but whatever this is, it's been hidden here for a reason." For the next 4 hours, Eleanor and Frank fought the flooding, eventually locating the main drainage access and clearing a massive clog that had prevented proper water flow. By dawn, the basement water level had begun to recede, though the damage to stored materials was extensive. Eleanor was too exhausted to care, her attention now fixed on the mysterious metal box they had recovered from the hidden compartment. Once the immediate crisis had passed and Frank had gone home to change into dry clothes, promising to return with better pumping equipment, Eleanor turned her attention to the locked box. The padlock, though heavily corroded, still held firm. After several attempts to open it with various tools, Eleanor finally resorted to brute force, using a hammer and chisel to break the lock mechanism. Inside the box, wrapped in waterproof oilcloth that had protected the contents remarkably well, was a stack of papers and certificates that at first glance looked like ordinary legal documents. Eleanor carefully removed them, laying each one out on her makeshift dining table to examine more closely. What she found left her breathless. They were war bonds, hundreds of them, dating from 1942 to 1945, Series EUS savings, bonds issued during World War II to finance the war effort. Each bond had a face value ranging from $25 to $10,000, with the largest concentration being $1,000 bonds. A quick tally of just the first layer suggested a face value of over $2 million in 1940s currency. But what made Eleanor's discovery truly extraordinary was the fact that none of these bonds had ever been redeemed. For over 75 years, they had remained hidden in the wall of the fire station basement, apparently forgotten or deliberately concealed. And government savings bonds, unlike many financial instruments, continue to accrue interest even after their maturity date, a provision designed to ensure that bondholders would never lose the value of their patriotic investment. Beneath the bonds was a handwritten letter, the paper yellowed with age but the ink still legible. It was dated December 7, 1944, exactly 3 years after the Pearl Harbor attack. To whoever finds this cash, if you are reading this, I have likely gone to my grave without retrieving these bonds. My name is Captain Thomas Sullivan, commander of Millfield Fire Station, No. 3, and coordinator of our town's war bond drives. What you have found represents the collective sacrifice of every citizen in this town, from schoolchildren donating pennies to our wealthiest factory owners contributing thousands. These bonds were purchased in the name of our town for the future benefit of Millfield and its citizens. Our intention was to create a fund that would serve the community after the war's end. However, increasing concerns about municipal corruption and political interference have led me to secure these investments until a time when they can be properly used for their intended purpose. If I have not retrieved these bonds in my lifetime, I entrust them to the finder with a single moral obligation. Use this wealth to serve the community that sacrificed to create it. How you fulfill this obligation, I leave to your conscience. Captain Thomas Sullivan. Eleanor sat at her table, surrounded by bonds that represented both an unimaginable fortune and an equally overwhelming moral responsibility. Her hands trembled as she realized the magnitude of what she had discovered. These weren't simply valuable pieces of paper. They were the physical embodiment of an entire town's sacrifice during humanity's darkest hour, entrusted now to her care by the accident of a basement flood. What Eleanor didn't yet understand was exactly how valuable these bonds had become over 3/4 of a century. That would require expert assessment and would reveal a figure that would shock not just Eleanor and her family, but the entire financial world. What she held was likely the largest cache of unredeemed war bonds ever discovered, worth potentially hundreds of millions in contemporary value. As dawn broke over Millfield, casting golden light through the fire station's tall windows, Eleanor Harrington sat amidst a treasure that would transform not just her life, but potentially the entire community. She had no way of knowing that her impulsive $15,000 purchase, deemed foolish by everyone who loved her, would soon be recognized as perhaps the most providential real estate decision in American history. But more importantly, she had no way of knowing how this discovery would test her character, her values, and her vision for her remaining years. The woman who had been financially ruined, emotionally devastated, and publicly pitied was about to become one of the wealthiest individuals in Connecticut, if she chose to claim that wealth for herself. Captain Sullivan's letter offered a moral direction, but no legal obligation. What Eleanor would do with this extraordinary discovery remained entirely her choice. As she carefully rewrapped the bonds and secured them in the box, Eleanor's mind raced with possibilities, responsibilities, and questions. The greatest of these was surprisingly simple. What would this treasure truly cost her? Not in dollars, but in purpose, in integrity, in the person she would become through her decisions in the days ahead. The fortune hidden in her basement represented not just wealth, but a profound moral crossroads that would define the rest of her life. The story of the fire station widow had only just begun. And like the building itself, Eleanor Harrington contained depths and possibilities that no one, not even she herself, had yet fully imagined. Eleanor's hands trembled as she carefully repositioned the war bonds in their protective oilcloth wrapping. The magnitude of her discovery was beginning to sink in. These weren't merely old pieces of paper. They represented both an extraordinary financial windfall and a profound moral responsibility. Captain Sullivan's letter weighed on her conscience, its words echoing in her thoughts. Use this wealth to serve the community that sacrificed to create it. For the first time since Richard's death, Eleanor felt something beyond grief and anxiety. It wasn't quite happiness. The emotion was too complex for such a simple label. It was something closer to purpose, a clarity of vision that had been absent during the fog of mourning and financial crisis. But with that clarity came questions that had no easy answers. Her first call was to Jessica, her eldest daughter, and the family's legal mind. Eleanor's voice shook as she described her discovery, trying to convey the scale of what she'd found without sounding delusional. "Mom, are you absolutely certain these are authentic?" Jessica asked, her attorney's caution evident even through the phone. "War bond forgeries aren't uncommon, especially for valuable series." "They look completely genuine," Eleanor replied. The paper, the printing, the serial numbers, everything matches what I've been able to research online. And they were hidden in a sealed compartment, wrapped in oilcloth. Someone went to extraordinary lengths to preserve and conceal them. Jessica's sigh was audible. Don't tell anyone else about this, not yet. I'm driving down tomorrow morning. We need to verify what you found before word gets out. What about Michael and Samantha? Let's wait until we know more. Michael will immediately start calculating values and tax implications, and Samantha, well, you know how she struggles with keeping exciting news to herself. True to her word, Jessica arrived early the next morning, having driven through dawn from Hartford. The skepticism on her face transformed to astonishment as Eleanor spread the bonds across the makeshift dining table, alongside Captain Sullivan's letter. Mother of God, Jessica whispered, her legal training momentarily forgotten as she picked up one of the $10,000 denomination bonds. These are real. I've seen war bonds in estate cases, but never anything like this. Never so many, and never unredeemed. Over the next several hours, mother and daughter meticulously inventoried the cash, creating a detailed spreadsheet of each bond's denomination, issue date, and serial number. The face value in 1940s currency totaled $2,378,500, an extraordinary sum for a small Connecticut town during wartime, representing countless sacrifices from citizens already living with ration books and shortages. The question now, Jessica said as they finished their inventory, is what these are actually worth today. War bonds were designed to appreciate over time, and these have been accruing interest for over 75 years. Eleanor nodded, glancing again at Captain Sullivan's letter. And the bigger question is what we should do with them. Legally, they belong to me since they were found on my property, correct? Jessica hesitated. From a strictly legal perspective, yes. Treasure trove law generally assigns ownership to the finder if the original owner can't be determined. But this is complicated. These bonds were purchased by the citizens of Millfield for community benefit. Captain Sullivan's letter makes that clear, even if it doesn't create a legally binding trust. So morally, they belong to the town? I didn't say that, Jessica replied carefully. Sullivan left the decision to the finder's conscience. That's you, Mom. You have no legal obligation to share this discovery with anyone. Eleanor looked around the fire station at the exposed wiring, the water damage from the recent flood, the enormous amount of work still needed to make the building functional. Her remaining funds had been depleted further by emergency flood remediation. A tiny fraction of these bonds' value would solve all her financial problems instantly. I need to think, Eleanor said finally. But first, we need expert verification and valuation. Someone who specializes in historical bonds and who can be trusted to be discreet. Jessica made some calls, leveraging her professional network, and by that afternoon had arranged a confidential meeting with Dr. Andrew Peterson, a financial historian and authenticator who specialized in American war bonds and government securities. He agreed to drive to Millfield the following day, bringing specialized equipment to verify the bond's authenticity. Dr. Peterson arrived punctually at 10 a.m., a trim man in his 60s with wire-rimmed glasses and an academic's thoughtful demeanor. Eleanor had expected a quick examination, but Peterson approached each bond with meticulous care, photographing, measuring, and examining the paper, printing, and security features under specialized lights and magnification. These are unquestionably authentic, he confirmed after several hours of examination. What's remarkable is their pristine condition. Whoever hid these understood preservation techniques well beyond what was common knowledge in the 1940s. And their value? Jessica asked, the question they'd been holding back throughout the examination. Dr. Peterson adjusted his glasses, consulting his calculations. Series E war bonds were designed with a 2.9% interest rate, compounded semi-annually. They originally had a 10-year maturity period, But unredeemed bonds continue to accrue interest for up to 30 years after issuance. But these are over 75 years old, Eleanor pointed out. Correct, which means they stopped accruing interest long ago, but at their final maturity value. Based on my calculations, this collection is worth approximately $251.7 million in current value. The number hung in the air, almost too large to comprehend. $250 million, Jessica whispered. Mother, that makes you responsible for an extraordinary legacy, Eleanor finished, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. This isn't just money. It's the collective sacrifice of an entire generation of Millfield citizens. Dr. Peterson nodded appreciatively. These represent one of the largest caches of unredeemed war bonds ever discovered. The historical significance alone is remarkable. May I ask what you intend to do with them? Eleanor glanced at Captain Sullivan's letter, which she had shown to Peterson as part of the authentication process. I'm still deciding. The captain left that to my conscience. After Peterson departed, Eleanor and Jessica sat in stunned silence, trying to process the implications of the valuation. You could redeem just one of the $10,000 bonds, Jessica finally said. That would give you over $1 million, enough to complete the renovation, create financial security for yourself, and still have plenty left over. No one would ever know about the rest. The suggestion hung in the air, tempting in its practicality. Eleanor could solve all her financial problems with just a tiny fraction of her discovery, keeping the remainder sealed away for future consideration. I need time to think, Eleanor said. This isn't just about me or what I need. It's bigger than that. That night, after Jessica had returned to Hartford with promises to keep the discovery confidential for now, Eleanor sat alone in her makeshift apartment above the fire station. The box of bonds was securely locked in the storage cabinet, but its presence filled the room like a physical weight. $250 million. The number was almost meaningless in its enormity. It was enough to completely transform her life, her children's lives, and their children's lives for generations. It was also enough to transform Millfield, itself a town of just under 15,000 people that had never fully recovered from the manufacturing decline of the 1980s. Sleep eluded her as she wrestled with the moral dimensions of her discovery. By dawn, Eleanor had made her decision. She would honor Captain Sullivan's intentions, but in her own way, a plan that began to form with surprising clarity as morning light filtered through the fire station windows. Her first step was to contact Michael and Samantha, bringing them into the small circle of people who knew about the discovery. Michael arrived from Boston that evening, skepticism written across his features until he saw the bonds for himself. As a financial advisor, he immediately grasped their significance. "Mom, this is—" he began, lost for words for perhaps the first time in his adult life. "Life-changing," Eleanor finished. "For all of us. But I've made some decisions about how to proceed, and I need your support." She outlined her plan, watching their expressions shift from surprise to thoughtful consideration as she explained her vision. By the time she finished, all three children were nodding, albeit with varying degrees of enthusiasm. "It's unorthodox," Jessica admitted, "and it will be complicated legally. But I think it honors the spirit of Captain Sullivan's letter." Michael nodded slowly. "From a financial perspective, it's less than optimal for personal gain. But I understand your reasoning, and I support it." Samantha, the most emotional of Eleanor's children, had tears in her eyes. "Dad would be so proud of you, Mom. It's just incredible." The next phase required careful planning and absolute discretion. Over the following 2 weeks, Eleanor and her children worked with Dr. Peterson and a small team of specialized attorneys to create the legal framework for what would come next. The bonds were transferred to a secure facility while authentication and redemption processes were initiated with the Treasury Department. Meanwhile, Eleanor continued her renovation work on the fire station with renewed vigor, but now with professional contractors handling the major structural and systems work. To the outside world, she explained this sudden ability to afford skilled labor as the result of a small inheritance from a distant cousin, plausible enough to avoid immediate suspicion, but modest enough not to attract undue attention. 6 weeks after the flood that had led to her discovery, Eleanor was ready to implement the first phase of her plan. She scheduled a meeting with Mayor Robert Jenkins and the Millfield Town Council, requesting 15 minutes during their regular public session to discuss a proposal regarding the old fire station. The council chambers were sparsely populated that Tuesday evening. Typically only a handful of dedicated citizens attended the routine meetings. Eleanor sat quietly through discussions of zoning variances and public works projects, her heart pounding as her agenda item approached. Next, we have Eleanor Harrington requesting time to discuss Fire Station No. 3, Mayor Jenkins announced, glancing curiously at Eleanor. Since purchasing the building, she had kept to herself, attracting little attention beyond initial curiosity about the widow who had bought the dilapidated structure. Eleanor approached the podium, her carefully prepared notes trembling slightly in her hands. Behind her, Jessica, Michael, and Samantha sat in silent support. Thank you, Mayor Jenkins and council members, for this opportunity to speak. As you know, I purchased the former Fire Station No. 3 at municipal auction 8 months ago. What you don't know is what I discovered during a basement flood 6 weeks ago. Eleanor proceeded to tell the story of finding the hidden compartment and the extraordinary cache of war bonds within. She watched the council members' expressions shift from polite interest to disbelief to astonishment as she described the verification process and the stunning valuation of $251.7 million. These bonds represent the collective sacrifice of Millfield citizens during World War II, Eleanor continued, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. Captain Sullivan's letter makes clear they were purchased for the future benefit of this community. While legally they became mine when I discovered them, morally they belong to the legacy of this town's greatest generation. The chamber had fallen completely silent, even the usually restless council members frozen in their seats. Therefore, I've established the Millfield Legacy Foundation with an initial endowment of $226.5 million, 90% of the bond's total value. This foundation will support community development, education, healthcare, and infrastructure projects throughout Millfield in perpetuity. A gasp rippled through the room. The remaining 10%, approximately $25 million, I will retain personally, to be shared with my family. This seems a fair finder's fee for bringing this treasure back to the community for which it was intended, while ensuring the vast majority serves its original purpose. Mayor Jenkins found his voice first. Mrs. Harrington, this is extraordinary. Are you certain about this decision? Legally, as you said, you could claim the entire amount. Eleanor smiled. I'm certain, Mayor. The fire station gave me a second chance when I needed it most. Now it's giving Millfield a second chance too. Captain Sullivan entrusted this decision to my conscience, and my conscience is clear. The impact of Eleanor's announcement rippled through Millfield like a stone dropped in still water. The local newspaper ran the story under the headline, Widow's Flood Reveals Fortune, World War II Bonds Worth $250 found in fire station basement. Regional and then national media picked up the story, focusing on both the extraordinary discovery and Eleanor's decision to share the vast majority with the community. In the days that followed, Eleanor received hundreds of letters, emails, and phone calls, some congratulating her generosity, others questioning her sanity for not keeping more for herself. Financial advisors offered unsolicited services. Distant relatives she'd never heard of suddenly discovered their connection to the Harrington family. Documentary filmmakers requested exclusive rights to tell her story. Through it all, Eleanor maintained a quiet dignity, granting few interviews and focusing instead on finalizing the legal structure of the Millfield Legacy Foundation. She assembled a board of directors that included respected community leaders, financial experts, and one representative each from families who could prove their ancestors had contributed to the original war bond drives, a nod to the generational connection that spans 7 decades. The Foundation's first approved project was the complete restoration of Fire Station No. 3 as a community center, with dedicated spaces for senior programs, youth activities, and a small museum commemorating both the station's history and the extraordinary war bond discovery. Eleanor would maintain private apartment residence on the top floor, her reward, along with the $25 million finder's fee for bringing this legacy back to life. As work began on transforming the fire station, Eleanor found herself transforming as well. The withdrawn widow who had purchased the building in desperate circumstances was giving way to a confident woman with purpose and vision. She had discovered strengths she never knew she possessed: resilience, determination, and a moral compass that guided her through an extraordinary ethical dilemma. "You know, you could have kept all of it," Michael told her one evening as they sat on the fire station's roof deck, watching sunset paint Millfield's modest skyline in gold and crimson. "No one would have known." Eleanor smiled. "I would have known. And that matters more than the money. Still, $25 million is a lot less than $251 million, he pointed out with the precision of a financial advisor. "That's a significant opportunity cost." "Is it?" Eleanor asked, sipping her tea. "What exactly have I lost?" "I have financial security for the rest of my life. You and your sisters have substantial trusts. Your children will have college funds and starter homes. What more do we need?" Michael considered this. "When you put it that way. Meanwhile, this town gets a second chance. Schools that were cutting programs will now have endowed excellence funds. The community hospital that was at risk of closing can upgrade its facilities and expand services. Parks will be improved, infrastructure updated, small businesses supported. Thousands of lives improved for generations to come." She gestured toward Main Street, where already there were signs of renewed activity, a boarded-up storefront being renovated, new planters installed along the sidewalks. "That's not an opportunity cost, Michael. That's an opportunity created." As her son absorbed this perspective, Eleanor reflected on how completely her life had changed in less than a year. From the devastating loss of Richard to the brink of financial ruin, from the desperate purchase of an abandoned building to the discovery that would define her legacy, each step of the journey had transformed her in ways she could never have anticipated. The greatest transformation wasn't financial but personal. Eleanor Harrington was no longer defined primarily as Richard's widow or as the mother of 3 accomplished adults. She had become a woman with her own identity, her own purpose, her own impact on the world. The fire station had indeed given her a second chance, not just through the extraordinary treasure hidden in its walls, but through the opportunity to discover her own capacity for courage, determination, and moral clarity. In saving the abandoned building, Eleanor had ultimately saved herself, finding purpose and identity when both seemed irretrievably lost. As twilight deepened over Millfield, Eleanor felt a profound sense of peace. The decisions she had made weren't the ones most people would have expected, perhaps not even the ones Richard would have made, but they were authentically hers. For the first time in her life, Eleanor was charting her own course, guided by her own moral compass rather than external expectations or conventional wisdom. The fire station stood as a testament to second chances for buildings, for communities, and for people who had the courage to see possibility where others saw only loss and decay. Its transformation from abandoned relic to vibrant community center paralleled Eleanor's own journey from grief-stricken widow to community benefactor and visionary. What had begun with loss was ending with extraordinary possibility, proof that sometimes life's darkest moments can lead to the most unexpected light, if only we have the courage to keep moving forward, one uncertain step at a time. 6 months after Eleanor Harrington's extraordinary discovery transformed both her life and the future of Millfield, the renovation of Fire Station No. 3 was nearing completion. What had once been a dilapidated building condemned by most as worthless was now a stunning example of adaptive reuse architecture. Its red brick exterior restored to its 1912 glory, while its interior had been completely reimagined for community purpose. The ground floor, where fire trucks had once waited for emergency calls, now housed a community center with flexible spaces for senior activities, youth programs, and public gatherings. The apparatus bay doors had been replaced with enormous glass windows that flooded the space with natural light while preserving the building's distinctive facade. A small museum dedicated to the fire station's history and the remarkable war bond discovery occupied what had once been the captain's office, with Captain Sullivan's letter prominently displayed alongside interactive exhibits about Millfield's contributions to the war effort. Eleanor's upstairs apartment had been transformed from makeshift living quarters into a comfortable home that balanced modern amenities with historical character. Exposed brick walls and restored hardwood floors provided warmth and authenticity, while new plumbing, electrical systems, and energy-efficient windows ensured comfort and sustainability. A roof deck offered peaceful outdoor space with views of Millfield's modest skyline. But the most significant transformation wasn't the building itself. It was what was happening inside it and throughout Millfield as the Millfield Legacy Foundation began dispersing its first grants. On a crisp autumn morning, Eleanor stood before a gathering of community members, local officials, and media representatives for the official ribbon-cutting ceremony of what was now called the Sullivan Community Center at historic Fire Station No. 3. The crowd was far larger than anyone had anticipated, filling the newly landscaped grounds surrounding the building. "When I purchased this building 11 months ago," Eleanor began, her voice steady and confident in a way that still sometimes surprised her, "I was a woman defined primarily by loss of my husband, my financial security, and my sense of purpose. This building was similarly defined by what it had lost: its function, its dignity, its connection to the community it once served." She gestured toward the beautifully restored structure behind her. "Today, both of us stand before you transformed, not just restored, but reimagined. We've both been given second chances that neither of us expected, and we've both found new purposes that honor our histories while creating something entirely new." Mayor Jenkins stepped forward to cut the ceremonial ribbon, but Eleanor wasn't finished. "Before we officially open these doors, I want to share something I've learned through this extraordinary journey. Our greatest moments of desperation can become our greatest opportunities for transformation, but only if we're brave enough to see possibility where others see only loss and decay." The mayor nodded respectfully and stepped back, allowing Eleanor to continue. "Captain Sullivan and the citizens of Millfield who purchased these bonds during World War II understood something profound about community and sacrifice. They gave what they could, sometimes just pennies, sometimes thousands of dollars, not knowing if they would personally benefit from that sacrifice, but believing in a better future for their town and their children." Eleanor paused, looking out at the faces before her, from elderly residents who remembered Millfield's manufacturing heyday to young families who had known only its struggle for economic revival. "Today, we honor their sacrifice by creating our own vision for Millfield's future. The Sullivan Community Center is just the beginning. Through the Millfield Legacy Foundation, we're investing in education, healthcare, small business development, and infrastructure projects that will transform this community for generations to come." As Eleanor finished her speech and joined Mayor Jenkins in cutting the ribbon, she felt a profound sense of purpose and belonging that she had never expected to find again after Richard's death. The widow who had once sat alone in her car outside the courthouse, clutching her last financial resources and wondering how she would survive, had discovered not just extraordinary treasure, but extraordinary capacity within herself. The ceremony transitioned to an open house, with community members exploring the new facilities while enjoying refreshments provided by local businesses. Eleanor moved through the crowd, accepting congratulations and sharing in the community's excitement. But what touched her most deeply were the quiet conversations with elderly residents who remembered the fire station in its original incarnation. Harold Schmidt, a 92-year-old former firefighter who had served at Station No. 3 in the 1950s, approached Eleanor with tears in his eyes. "My father worked with Captain Sullivan," he said, his voice quavering with emotion. "Dad was too old for military service, but he sold war bonds door to door throughout Millfield. He always said those bonds were our town's investment in victory and in our future. He would be so proud to see this day." Eleanor took his weathered hands in hers. "Would you share some of your memories for our oral history project? We're collecting stories about the station and the people who served here." Harold nodded enthusiastically. "I'd be honored. There are stories about this place that shouldn't be lost to time." As the day progressed, Eleanor watched her children engage with the community in ways she had never seen before. Jessica, the normally reserved attorney, was animatedly discussing plans for the Foundation's legal aid clinic with local paralegals. Michael, who had always kept Millfield at arm's length after establishing his career in Boston, was deep in conversation with the high school principal about a financial literacy program. Samantha, who had inherited Richard's artistic talent, was showing children how to create tile mosaics that would eventually become a permanent installation in the community center's entryway. By late afternoon, as the celebration continued with live music from local bands in the newly created pocket park beside the building, Eleanor slipped away to her apartment for a moment of quiet reflection. From her roof deck, she could see Millfield spread out before her, not just as it was, but as it could be. The first wave of foundation grants was already making a visible impact. The community hospital was breaking ground on a new emergency department. The public library was extending its hours and expanding its digital resources. 3 vacant storefronts on Main Street were being renovated for new businesses receiving foundation startup support. The high school was preparing to launch advanced placement courses that had been cut from the budget years ago. But beyond these tangible projects was something less visible but equally profound, a renewed sense of hope and possibility throughout Millfield. For decades, the town had been defined by economic decline, young people leaving for opportunities elsewhere, and a prevailing sense that Millfield's best days were in the past. Now, for the first time in generations, there was genuine optimism about the future. A knock at her door interrupted Eleanor's reflections. It was Frank Delaney, the retired building inspector who had helped her during the flood that led to her discovery. "Hope I'm not intruding," Frank said, hesitating at the threshold. "I just wanted to see how the apartment turned out." "Not at all," Eleanor replied, welcoming him in. "I wouldn't be here if not for your help that night." Frank walked through the space, nodding appreciatively at the craftsmanship. "You've done right by this old building," he said finally. "Most developers would have gutted it completely or torn it down. You preserved its character while giving it new life." "Much like what Millfield is doing for me," Eleanor replied. "I came here looking for shelter. I found purpose instead." Frank studied her for a moment. "You know, when you first bought this place, everyone thought you'd lost your mind. The widow with the crazy plan. Now they're calling you visionary." Eleanor laughed. "The line between crazy and visionary is success, I suppose." "No," Frank said thoughtfully. "The line is courage. Most people wouldn't have taken the risk you did, even in desperate circumstances. And most people, finding what you found, wouldn't have shared it the way you have." Eleanor led Frank to the roof deck, where they could see the celebration continuing below. "I've been thinking a lot about risk lately," she said. "We're taught to avoid it, especially as we get older. Play it safe. Protect what you have. But sometimes the safest choice is the riskiest one in the long run." "How do you mean?" If I'd listened to conventional wisdom, sold my house before foreclosure, found a small apartment, taken whatever job I could get at my age, I might have survived, but I wouldn't have thrived. I would have slowly depleted whatever resources I have left while watching opportunities pass me by. Eleanor gestured toward the community gathering below. Instead, I took a risk that everyone thought was foolish, and it led to this. Not just the money, but the purpose. The connection. The chance to make a difference. Frank nodded slowly. You're changing how people think about second acts, Eleanor. Not just here in Millfield, but everywhere your story has reached. And her story had indeed reached far. National media had covered the war bond discovery and Eleanor's decision to share the wealth with Millfield. Financial publications had analyzed the unprecedented growth of the bonds over 7 decades. Historical societies had studied Captain Sullivan's vision and the community's wartime sacrifice. But most meaningfully, Eleanor had begun receiving letters from people across the country who found themselves in circumstances similar to hers, widowed, financially vulnerable, facing uncertain futures in their later years. They wrote of how her story had inspired them to reconsider their own capacity for risk and reinvention, to look for possibility in circumstances that seemed defined only by loss. Eleanor had started responding to these letters personally, sharing not just the extraordinary stroke of luck that had led to the war bond discovery, but the more universal lessons she had learned about resilience, purpose, and the courage to begin again. These exchanges had evolved into a blog called Second Chances, where Eleanor shared her ongoing journey and invited others to share theirs. The blog had quickly grown from a handful of readers to thousands, creating a community of people navigating life transitions with courage and creativity. Eleanor found herself in the unexpected role of mentor and inspiration to others walking paths similar to hers, without the dramatic financial windfall, perhaps, but with the same need to reimagine their lives after significant loss. As Frank departed and Eleanor rejoined the celebration, she found herself approached by a woman she didn't recognize, elegantly dressed, probably in her early 60s, with a thoughtful expression. "Mrs. Harrington? I'm Catherine Whitfield from the National Endowment for Community Renewal. I've been following your story with great interest." Eleanor shook her hand, curious. "I'm not familiar with your organization." "We're relatively new," Catherine explained. "We study and support innovative approaches to community revitalization, particularly in smaller cities and towns facing economic challenges. What you've created here with the Millfield Legacy Foundation is, frankly, revolutionary." Eleanor smiled. "I wouldn't go that far. We're just putting resources where they're needed most." "It's more than that," Catherine insisted. "Most community foundations grow gradually over decades through accumulated donations. Yours began with extraordinary resources but faced the challenge of deploying them effectively, without creating dependency or wasteful spending. The governance model you've created, combining professional expertise with direct community representation and historical connection, is something we'd like to study and potentially replicate elsewhere." Catherine's interest highlighted something Eleanor had been increasingly aware of: the responsibility that came with managing such significant resources. The $226.5 million endowment could transform Millfield, but only if deployed with wisdom, transparency, and genuine community engagement. "We're still learning," Eleanor admitted. "There's no playbook for suddenly deploying resources of this magnitude in a community of 15,000 people. We're trying to balance immediate impact with sustainable growth, addressing urgent needs while building long-term capacity." "That's precisely why we'd like to document your process," Catherine replied. "Communities across America are struggling with similar challenges, just without the dramatic financial windfall. The principles you're developing could help others leverage whatever resources they have more effectively." The conversation with Catherine continued throughout the evening and evolved into an ongoing partnership. The National Endowment would study Millfield's transformation process, providing external expertise while documenting the community's journey for others to learn from. It was another unexpected dimension of Eleanor's new purpose, not just transforming Millfield, but potentially helping other communities find their own paths to renewal. As the celebration wound down and twilight settled over Millfield, Eleanor found herself sitting on a bench in the pocket park beside the fire station, watching as the last community members drifted homeward. Jessica joined her, bringing 2 cups of tea from the community center kitchen. "Quite a day," Jessica said, handing a cup to her mother. "How are you feeling?" Eleanor considered the question. "Grateful, overwhelmed, purposeful. It's hard to believe that less than a year ago, I was sitting in my car outside the courthouse, wondering how I would survive another month." Jessica nodded. "You've come so far, Mom, not just financially, but as a person. You're not the same woman who lost Dad." "No," Eleanor agreed softly. "I'm not. I loved your father deeply, and I miss him every day. But his death forced me to discover parts of myself I never knew existed: strength, courage, vision. I had to become someone new when I lost him, and I'm finally starting to recognize and appreciate that person. I think Dad would be proud of who you've become." Eleanor smiled. "I think he'd be surprised, actually." I surprised myself. As mother and daughter sat in comfortable silence, watching stars appear above Millfield, Eleanor reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. The path from devastated widow to community visionary had been neither straight nor easy. It had required her to question conventional wisdom, take extraordinary risks, make difficult ethical choices, and reimagine not just her circumstances, but her very identity. Yet each challenge had revealed capacities she hadn't known she possessed. The desperate purchase of the abandoned fire station had uncovered not just hidden treasure, but hidden strength. The flood that had threatened to destroy her progress had instead revealed unprecedented opportunity. The moral dilemma of the war bonds had clarified her values and purpose in ways comfort never could have. "You know what I've learned through all this?" Eleanor said finally. "Transformation rarely comes when we're comfortable. It's crisis and challenge that force us to discover who we really are and what we're truly capable of achieving." Jessica considered this. "That's true, but not everyone facing crisis finds $250 million in war bonds, Mom." Eleanor laughed. "No, but the money isn't the real treasure. The real treasure is discovering that at 59, I'm not finished. I'm not just Richard's widow or your mother or a woman trying to survive loss. I'm someone with unique contributions to make, unique purpose to fulfill." She gestured toward the illuminated community center, where a few volunteers were still cleaning up from the day's celebration. "That's the message I hope people take from my story, beyond the dramatic discovery. It's never too late to begin again. It's never too late to reimagine your life. And sometimes, the path that seems most frightening is the one that leads to the greatest possibility." As Eleanor and Jessica walked back toward the fire station that had become both home and symbol of second chances, the lights of Millfield twinkled below them, not just as they were, but as they could be. The transformation that had begun with one widow's desperate gamble was now rippling outward, creating new possibilities for an entire community and beyond. The fire station stood as testament to the power of seeing value where others saw only decay, of finding purpose in what others had abandoned, of creating new beginnings from apparent endings. Its transformation from neglected relic to vibrant community hub paralleled Eleanor's own journey and potentially Millfield's, from loss and uncertainty to renewed purpose and possibility. What had begun with one woman's courage to risk everything on an abandoned building had become something far greater: a vision for community renewal, a model for purposeful philanthropy, and living proof that it's never too late to write a new chapter in the story of a life, a building, or a town. Eleanor Harrington, the fire station widow, had discovered that second chances aren't just possible, They're often where our greatest contributions and most authentic selves are finally revealed. 3 years had passed since Eleanor Harrington's extraordinary discovery transformed both her life and the town of Millfield. The autumn morning dawned crisp and golden as Eleanor stood at the edge of what had once been an abandoned parking lot behind the fire station, now transformed into Millfield's first community garden. Rows of raised beds overflowed with late-season vegetables and flowers, tended by volunteers ranging from elementary school students to retirement community residents. "We've come a long way from sandbags and flooding," said Frank Delaney, joining Eleanor at the garden's entrance. The retired building inspector had become one of her closest friends and a valued board member of the Millfield Legacy Foundation. Eleanor smiled, watching as Maria Gutierrez, owner of the successful bakery across the square, demonstrated proper harvesting techniques to a group of teenagers enrolled in the foundation's culinary apprenticeship program. From disaster to growth, literally and figuratively. The garden was just one of dozens of foundation-supported initiatives that had taken root throughout Millfield over the past 3 years. What had begun with Eleanor's impulsive purchase of an abandoned fire station had blossomed into a comprehensive community revitalization that was gaining national attention as a model for small-town renewal. "The National Endowment team is arriving at noon," Frank reminded her. "Catherine said they're bringing some special guests." Eleanor nodded. The National Endowment for Community Renewal had been documenting Millfield's transformation since the Sullivan Community Center opened 3 years earlier. What had begun as a case study had evolved into a comprehensive research project examining how communities could leverage existing assets, physical, financial, and human, to create sustainable revitalization. "I still can't believe we're hosting a national symposium on community renewal," Eleanor said, checking her watch. 5 years ago, I was watching my house go into foreclosure. Now policy experts are coming to Millfield to learn from our experience." The symposium, scheduled to begin the following day, would bring together community leaders, policy experts, and funders from across the country to study what was now being called the Millfield model, a holistic approach to community revitalization that balanced economic development with social well-being, combining significant financial resources with authentic community engagement. Eleanor had initially been uncomfortable with her central role in this story. She had never sought the spotlight, and the media attention following the war bond discovery had been overwhelming at times. But she had gradually come to accept that her journey from desperate widow to community visionary resonated deeply with people seeking inspiration for their own life transitions. Her Second Chances blog had evolved into a book by the same name, which had spent 27 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list. The royalties which Eleanor had initially directed to the foundation had instead been used to establish a separate fund specifically supporting older women facing financial crises. The Eleanor Harrington Second Chance Fund provided emergency assistance, housing support, and entrepreneurship grants for women over 50 who, like Eleanor, were reinventing their lives after significant loss. As Eleanor and Frank walked back toward the community center, they passed evidence of Millfield's transformation at every turn. Storefronts that had been vacant for decades now housed thriving businesses, a bookstore, cafe, an artisan cooperative, a tech training center for youth. The sidewalks had been widened and beautified with planters, benches, and public art created by local artists. Most significantly, there were people, residents, and visitors alike enjoying the revitalized downtown. "Remember how empty these streets used to be?" Frank asked, nodding toward a group of tourists examining a historical marker outside what had once been the town's original general store, now a museum of local history. "I remember thinking I'd made the worst mistake of my life buying that fire station," Eleanor admitted. "The first time I drove through downtown, I wondered if Millfield was already too far gone to save." "Most people thought it was," Frank replied. "That's what makes what's happened here so remarkable. It wasn't just the money, though that certainly helped. It was the vision seeing possibility where others saw only decay. Eleanor had heard variations of this sentiment countless times over the past 3 years, but she still struggled with accepting credit for Millfield's renaissance. The money was pure luck, she insisted. Anyone could have found those bonds. But not everyone would have shared them the way you did, Frank countered. And not everyone would have created the governance structures to ensure the resources were used effectively and equitably. Those weren't accidental. Eleanor couldn't argue with this assessment. While the discovery of the war bonds had been extraordinary luck, the decisions that followed had been deliberate and often difficult. Creating the Millfield Legacy Foundation with clear governance principles, transparency requirements, and community representation had required months of careful planning and countless difficult conversations. The foundation's board included financial and legal experts who ensured responsible stewardship of resources, but also representatives from every neighborhood in Millfield, ensuring that benefits were distributed equitably rather than concentrated in already advantaged areas. A youth advisory council gave voice to younger residents, while a historical committee, which included several descendants of original war bond purchasers, helped maintain connection to the legacy that had made it all possible. Most importantly, the foundation operated on a principle of catalytic philanthropy rather than dependency-creating charity. Projects were designed to build community capacity, leverage additional resources, and create sustainable systems that would continue functioning long after initial foundation support ended. As Eleanor and Frank reached the community center, they found Catherine Whitfield from the National Endowment already waiting for them, accompanied by an elegantly dressed older woman whom Eleanor didn't recognize. "Eleanor, we're early, I know," Catherine said, embracing her. But Victoria was eager to see everything before the crowds arrived tomorrow. "Victoria Harriman," the woman introduced herself, extending her hand. "Founder of the Harriman Institute for Social Innovation. I've been following your work here with great interest." Eleanor recognized the name immediately. The Harriman Institute was one of the country's most prestigious philanthropic organizations, known for supporting innovative approaches to social challenges. Having Victoria Harriman in Millfield was like having royalty visit, at least in the world of community development. "We're honored to have you here, Ms. Harriman," Eleanor said, shaking her hand. "Though I should warn you that we're still very much a work in progress." Victoria smiled. "The best initiatives always are. Perfection is less interesting than evolution, especially when it comes to community transformation." As they toured the community center and surrounding downtown, Eleanor found herself increasingly impressed by Victoria's incisive questions and genuine interest in Millfield's journey. Unlike some visitors who focused exclusively on the dramatic war bond discovery, Victoria wanted to understand the decision-making processes, governance structures, and community engagement strategies that had guided the use of those resources. The bonds provided extraordinary financial capital, Victoria observed as they sat in the community center's cafe after the tour. "But what impresses me most is how you've leveraged that to build social capital. The connections between people, the sense of shared purpose and possibility that's much harder to create than economic development." Eleanor nodded. "We learned early on that physical and economic improvements weren't enough. People needed to believe in Millfield's future and see themselves as part of creating it." Victoria leaned forward, her expression thoughtful. "That's precisely why I've come, Eleanor. The Harriman Institute is launching a new initiative focused on small-town revitalization across America. We're looking to identify communities that have successfully navigated the transition from decline to renewal, and to support peer learning networks that can spread effective approaches." She paused, studying Eleanor. "Millfield's story is unique in many ways. Not many towns discover hidden treasure, after all. But the principles you've applied are universally relevant. We'd like Millfield to be the first community in our national network, with you serving as a senior advisor to the initiative." Eleanor blinked in surprise. "Me? I'm not an expert in community development or philanthropy. I'm just a woman who took extraordinary risk in desperate circumstances, found unexpected treasure, and made difficult ethical choices that prioritized community well-being over personal gain," Victoria finished. "Then leverage that initial good fortune into sustainable systems for continued growth and renewal. That's precisely the expertise we need." The conversation continued through lunch, with Victoria outlining a vision for a national network of small towns, sharing strategies for revitalization. The Harriman Institute would provide funding, technical assistance, and connections to policy experts, but the real power would come from communities learning directly from each other's experiences. "We've been doing this work for nearly 70 years, Victoria explained, and we've learned that the most effective solutions come from within communities themselves, not from outside experts. What works in Millfield won't work identically in rural Georgia or Montana, but the principles can translate if communities have opportunities to learn from each other." By the time they finished lunch, Eleanor found herself not only accepting Victoria's invitation but genuinely excited about the possibility of helping other communities find their own paths to renewal. As someone who had navigated her own journey from desperation to purpose, she understood the power of seeing possibility through another's experience. Later that afternoon, as Eleanor prepared for the welcome reception for symposium participants, she took a rare moment of solitude on her roof deck. The October sunset painted Millfield in gold and crimson, highlighting how much had changed in the 5 years since she had first driven through town looking at the abandoned fire station. The physical transformations were evident everywhere: renovated buildings, improved infrastructure, new businesses, and enhanced public spaces. But the less visible changes were even more profound. Millfield's population had increased for the first time in 40 years, with young families and entrepreneurs drawn by affordable housing, improving schools, and the palpable sense of a community on the rise. More importantly, there was a renewed sense of agency among longtime residents. People who had once felt powerless to change Millfield's trajectory now participated actively in shaping its future through neighborhood councils, volunteer initiatives, and community planning processes. The culture of resignation that had defined the town for decades had given way to a culture of possibility. Eleanor's personal transformation had been equally profound. The devastated widow who had purchased the fire station in desperate circumstances was unrecognizable in the confident community leader she had become. At 64, she was more purposeful, more engaged, and more authentically herself than she had ever been, even during the happiest years of her marriage. "Mom, are you up here?" Jessica's voice called from the stairwell. "People are starting to arrive downstairs." Eleanor turned to see not just Jessica, but all 3 of her children emerging onto the roof deck. Michael had relocated his financial advisory practice from Boston to Millfield 2 years earlier, finding unexpected fulfillment in helping local businesses and residents build financial stability. Samantha had created an arts education program that brought professional artists to work with students in Millfield schools, transforming not just educational opportunities, but the town's cultural landscape. "We wanted to give you something before the craziness of the symposium begins," Jessica said, holding out a small package wrapped in simple brown paper. "From all of us." Eleanor unwrapped the gift to find a silver bracelet with a single charm, a perfectly detailed miniature replica of the fire station. "It's beautiful," she said, admiring the intricate craftsmanship. "But what's the occasion?" 5 years ago today, you bought this building at auction," Michael explained. "We thought that deserved commemoration, considering everything that's flowed from that decision. Especially since we all thought you'd lost your mind at the time," Samantha added with a grin. "This is our way of admitting we were spectacularly wrong." Eleanor laughed, fastening the bracelet around her wrist. To be fair, it was an objectively terrible financial decision based on the information available at the time. I had no way of knowing what was hidden in the walls. But you knew something we didn't, Jessica said thoughtfully. You knew you needed to take control of your own destiny, even if it seemed irrational to everyone else. That's what we're really celebrating, not just the lucky discovery, but the courage it took to make that first step when everyone was telling you to play it safe. Eleanor considered this, touched by her children's understanding of what that moment had truly meant. I was terrified, she admitted, but somehow more terrified of not trying anything to change my circumstances. I couldn't bear the thought of simply watching my life continue to unravel without taking some kind of action, even if it seemed desperate. And that's what makes your story so powerful to others, Michael said. The war bonds make it dramatic, but the real story is about finding courage in your darkest moment. That's universal. As they descended to the community center for the reception, Eleanor was struck by how completely her relationship with her children had evolved. They had moved from protecting her, sometimes patronizingly, to genuinely respecting her as a person with wisdom and courage to offer. They had become not just family, but true friends and allies in the work of community renewal. The reception was filled with faces both familiar and new Millfield residents who had been part of the revitalization journey, representatives from other communities eager to learn from their experience, policy experts and funders interested in supporting similar transformations elsewhere. As Eleanor circulated through the crowd, she was struck by the power of connection that had emerged from what had begun as personal crisis. Later that evening, as the reception wound down, Eleanor found herself standing with Victoria Harriman near the small museum exhibit that told the story of the war bond discovery. You know what strikes me most about your journey? Victoria said, studying Captain Sullivan's letter in its display case. How many decision points there were where things could have gone very differently. Eleanor nodded. I think about that often. If I hadn't been desperate enough to buy this building, if the basement hadn't flooded that night, if I'd decided to keep the bonds entirely for myself. Exactly, Victoria said. Life-changing moments often appear ordinary when we're living through them. It's only in retrospect that we see the crossroads for what they were. She turned to face Eleanor directly. That's why your story resonates so deeply with people. Not because of the dramatic discovery, but because it reminds us that seemingly small choices made with courage and integrity can lead to extraordinary outcomes. Not just for ourselves, but for entire communities. The following morning, as Eleanor prepared to welcome symposium participants officially, she reflected on Victoria's observation. 5 years earlier, sitting in her car outside the courthouse with a foreclosure notice and dwindling bank account, she could never have imagined the journey ahead. The desperate purchase of an abandoned building had led not just to financial recovery but to a completely reimagined life and purpose. As she took the podium and looked out at the gathered community leaders, policy experts, and funders, Eleanor felt a profound sense of connection to every person who had ever faced a crossroads between safety and possibility, between resignation and renewal. 5 years ago, she began, I was a widow facing financial ruin, making what everyone around me considered a terrible decision, spending my last resources on an sofa. And around me considered a terrible decision, spending my last resources on an abandoned building that no one else wanted. Today, I'm standing before you as living proof that our darkest moments can lead to our greatest purpose, if we have the courage to see possibility where others see only loss. Eleanor gestured toward the transformed community surrounding them. Millfield's story began with extraordinary luck, the discovery of forgotten war bonds. But what's happened since has been about choices, not luck. Choices to invest in people as well as places. Choices to build community ownership rather than dependency. Choices to honor the past while creating new possibilities for the future. She paused, making eye contact with participants from other communities, seeking their own paths to renewal. Every town has hidden treasures, not necessarily millions in war bonds, but assets and possibilities that may be overlooked or undervalued. the buildings that others have abandoned, the people whose potential has been dismissed, the historical and cultural legacies that can inspire new vision. As Eleanor continued her address, she shared not just Millfield's successes but its challenges and setbacks, the projects that hadn't worked as planned, the tensions that had emerged around priorities and resource allocation, the ongoing work of ensuring that revitalization benefited all residents rather than just the already advantaged. Renewal isn't a destination. It's a continuous journey, she concluded. One that requires courage, persistence, and the willingness to reimagine what's possible for ourselves and for our communities. That journey doesn't require extraordinary luck, but it does require the courage to take the first step when the path ahead seems uncertain. You know what I've learned from your story, Eleanor? Victoria said thoughtfully. That transformation rarely follows the path we expect. You came to Millfield seeking shelter and found purpose. You discovered financial treasure but created something far more valuable, a renewed sense of possibility for an entire community. Eleanor nodded, watching the lights of Millfield twinkle below. I've been thinking a lot about Captain Sullivan lately, she said. The man who hid those bonds for future benefit. He could never have imagined how his decision would transform lives 75 years later. We never really know the full impact of our choices, do we? No, Victoria agreed. We plant seeds without knowing exactly what will grow or who will harvest. That's the beauty and the mystery of the work we do. As her guests departed and Eleanor prepared for the final day of the symposium, she took a moment alone on the roof deck, watching as a full moon rose over Millfield. The town spread before her, not just as it was, but as it continued to become through the collective effort of people who had learned to see possibility rather than limitation. The fire station stood as testament to the power of second chances for buildings, for communities, and for individuals brave enough to reimagine their lives when circumstances force them to begin again. Its transformation from abandoned relic to vibrant community hub paralleled Eleanor's own journey from devastating loss to renewed purpose. What had begun with one widow's desperate gamble had rippled outward, creating new possibilities that extended far beyond Millfield itself. The model of community renewal pioneered here would soon inspire similar transformations in towns across the country, each finding their own path to renewal based on their unique assets and challenges. As Eleanor turned to go inside, her hand brushed the silver bracelet her children had given her, the tiny replica of the fire station that had changed everything. It would serve as a constant reminder that life's most difficult moments can sometimes lead to its greatest gifts, if we have the courage to see possibility where others see only loss. The broke widow who had gambled her last resources on an abandoned building had discovered not just financial treasure, but the greatest treasure of all, her own capacity for courage, vision, and renewal at a time when many would have surrendered to circumstances. In doing so, she had not only transformed her own life, but created ripples of possibility that would continue expanding long after her own story had become legend. In the quiet moonlight, Eleanor made a silent promise to herself and to all whose lives would be touched by the work ahead, to remember that it's never too late to begin again, that our greatest contributions often emerge from our deepest challenges, and that second chances aren't just possible, they're often where our most authentic selves and meaningful purposes are finally revealed. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.